Paul is the author of a popular series of Victorian-era romance novels centered on the heroine Misery Chastain. Paul drives back home after finishing the book, but he gets caught in a snowstorm, causing him to lose control of the car and swerve off the road, breaking his legs and dislocating his shoulder. In a flashback, Paul is speaking with his publishing agent, Marcia Sindel, who chastises him for killing off the main character in his latest novel, Misery's Child. Paul says that if he hadn't killed Misery, he would have spent his entire life writing about her. Also, he says that he's leaving for Colorado to finish the new book. Back in the present, Paul is knocked out but saved by Annie Wilkes, a former nurse who lives just outside of Silver Creek, and takes him to her remote home. Annie nurses Paul back to health with her nursing skills, stockpiled food, and a stash of codeine-based painkillers called a novel. She declares herself Paul's #1 fan and raves about him and his books. Meanwhile, Marcia suspects Paul is missing after not hearing from him and calls the Silver Creek sheriff, Buster, to report it. According to Buster, nothing has been heard around there, but he will run Paul's name through the system and keep in touch with Marcia. On the other hand, Marcia is unaware that the Silver Creek police force is more primitive than the NYPD, and Buster's system is a post-it note on the wall to remind himself of Paul Sheldon. While shaving Paul's face, Annie asks if she can read Paul's newest book, which she saved from the wreckage. Meanwhile, Buster begins the investigation and visits the hotel where Paul was last seen. While feeding him soup, Annie comments on how much she enjoys the book but dislikes the excessive use of profanity. She loses her cool and spills his soup, but she quickly recovers and apologizes. Buster and his wife Virginia are driving down the same road that Paul was driving before he crashed. Eventually, they come across a tree with a broken limb. Buster descends the hill to look around but returns when he sees nothing because the car is completely covered by snow. Annie drives by them as they get back into the car to go to the newspaper office. Back at the house, Annie shows Paul the copy of Misery's Child she purchased. When Paul inquires about roads, Annie replies that only the one leading into town is open. She claims she called the hospital and told them about Paul and what happened, as well as the agent. When Paul asks if the phone is working, Annie says that hers is still broken. Paul is concerned about his daughter and the fact that it is her birthday. Annie claims that the publisher would tell his daughter that he is fine. As Annie reads the book, she praises Paul, feeds him well, and introduces him to her pet pig, Misery. She tells Paul at one point that after her husband left her, she went to work at the hospital, where she first met Misery. After reading the book, Annie learns that Misery died in childbirth, and she bursts into a fit of rage, nearly hitting Paul. As she prepares to leave, she reveals that she did not contact the doctors, his agent, or his family, and no one knows where he is. She also tells him that if something bad happens to her, the same will happen to him, and then she drives off in her car. Paul gets out of bed, painfully slamming his legs on the floor, and tries to escape, but the door is locked. The next morning, Buster publishes an article about Paul's disappearance in the newspaper. He's on the phone with Marcia, but she says nothing has been reported yet. Virginia is on the other line, telling Buster that she requested a credit check on Paul Sheldon. His most recent credit card transaction occurred when he paid his bill at the Silver Creek Lodge. Annie returns that morning and helps Paul in getting back into bed. She apologizes for abandoning him and leaving him alone. Still, she refuses to take care of him until he completes a specific task. He must burn his untitled manuscript as a penance for killing her favorite character. Annie squirts lighter fluid on his bed, and after some hesitation, Paul sets fire to his handiwork. Following that, a helicopter carrying Buster in search of Paul passes overhead. Annie hands Paul his medication before leaving with the charred remains of the manuscript. Following that, Paul begins to hide his pain medication. Annie sets up a small table, brings in a typewriter, and announces that Paul will write a new novel called Misery's Return, which will bring the character back from the dead. She also declares that it will be a book written in her honor because she saved his life and nursed him back to health. However, when Paul mentions that she has purchased paper that leaves smudges, Annie gets enraged and slams the paper on his lap, tremendously hurting him. She scolds him even more and storms out the door to get him some better paper. On the other hand, Paul finds one of her bobby pins on the floor and uses it to unlock the door and find a way out. He tries the front door, but it is closed. He tries the phone in the living room, only to discover that it has been ruined. He knocks a ceramic penguin off the table while walking through the living room, which he catches but then repositions facing in a different direction. He discovers a small closet containing dozens of novel sample boxes and takes a package. The wheelchair won't fit through a door in the kitchen, so he has to crawl to it, only to discover that it is locked, and he notices a set of knives while there. When he hears Annie's car approaching, he rushes back into his room before Annie enters the house. Meanwhile, Paul's car is found, and the police believe he is dead. However, Buster has doubts after seeing dents on the door left by Annie, who used a crowbar to open it. Buster claims that Paul did not crawl out, concluding that he was pulled out by someone. Back in bed, Paul creates a small pocket with a piece of paper from Annie's pad of paper. Following that, he begins writing the book, convinced that Annie will kill him if he does not. However, she rejects his first attempt, comparing it to a cliffhanger from her childhood called Rocket Man. Paul tries again. This time, Annie accepts and enjoys it, and she says she'll put it on her Liberace records. Paul extends an invitation to Annie for dinner, which she accepts. Meanwhile, Buster has purchased several misery novels, claiming that if he can't find Paul, he can learn about his writings. Paul suggests that he and Annie raise a glass to misery during dinner. He dispatches Annie to find a candle. He poisons her wine with pill powder while she is away. When she returns and lights the candle, they begin the toast, but Annie knocks over the candle and spills her poisoned wine in her haste to pick it up. She apologizes profusely, pours more untainted wine, and they toast. Paul is disappointed but continues. Paul keeps writing, progressing in the book, with Annie reading the completed chapters to Liberace's Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1. As he completes each chapter, Annie fills in the missing ends. She's overjoyed with what he's accomplished and begs him to reveal the ending, but he politely declines. Annie comes in one night, depressed, and expresses her love for Paul and her fear of losing him. Paul wonders why he would lose her, and she responds that the book is almost finished, his legs are getting better, and he would want to leave. Paul says he likes it there, but Annie suspects he's lying. She pulls out a gun and says she's thinking about using it before shambling out of the house into the rain. While she is gone, Paul escapes his room and gets a knife from the kitchen to murder Annie. On his way back, he discovers a scrapbook filled with newspaper clippings, implying she is a serial killer. As a maternity nurse, she was suspected and tried for the murder of several infants, but the trial was thrown out due to a lack of evidence. Paul then returns to his room and lies in bed. He hides the knife in the sling around his arm, waiting for Annie to arrive. When she finally arrives, she goes upstairs and begins watching television. Paul tucks the knife beneath the mattress and goes to bed. Annie administers a hypodermic injection to Paul and straps him to the bed during the night. When he wakes up, Annie reveals that she is aware that he has left the room because of the ceramic penguin. She tells him what happened to diamond thieves in South Africa's Kimberley diamond mines. They hobbled as a punishment to prevent escape but not to impair their workability. She then uses a sledgehammer to break his ankles. After seeing Annie go into the general store and yell at a driver who cut her off, Buster goes to the library and looks through an old newspaper storybook, where he finds stories about the baby deaths in Annie's trial. He also discovers a quote she gave the reporters from a misery novel that he had written down. He visits the general store and speaks with the owner, Pete, who informs him that Annie has purchased a large quantity of typing paper. Buster assumes Paul is at the Wilkes farm and drives there. Annie injects Paul again and hides him in the basement before Buster arrives. The officer looks around the house and is about to leave when he hears the grill in the basement collapse. Annie shoots and kills Buster when he finds Paul. She tells Paul that they must die together. Paul agrees, but only if they finish the book first. Annie reluctantly agrees and goes to get his wheelchair. From the basement, Paul smuggles a can of charcoal lighter fluid. While Paul is finishing the book, he mentions to Annie that he needs a cigarette, a match, and a glass of champagne, a tradition that Annie is familiar with and eager to begin. When Annie hands Paul these items, he remarks that they need a second glass for her. She goes to get the second glass, overjoyed. When Annie returns, Paul soaks the manuscript in lighter fluid and sets it on fire with a match in front of her. Paul slams the typewriter on her head as she tries to extinguish the fire. Paul and Annie get into a fight, with Paul stuffing the burning pages into Annie's mouth. She stands up and approaches him, but Paul trips her, and she hits her head on the typewriter, knocking her out cold. Paul crawls out of the room, but Annie awakens and attempts to entice him back in. He grabs a nearby pig-shaped door stopper and hits her in the head, killing her. Paul is in New York City a few months later, walking with the help of a cane. He has a new book called The Higher Education of J. Philip Stone. Marcia indicates that it is receiving positive feedback from critics and has a chance of winning some awards. Marcia suggests he write a non-fiction book about his experiences with Annie Wilkes. Still, Paul declines because he is clearly suffering from psychological trauma due to his experiences and frequently has nightmares and hallucinations of Annie coming to get him for revenge. Paul sees Annie and reacts in horror as he says this. However, it is a hallucination, as the waitress tells Paul she is a big fan.